So if you are having trouble with the audio, you can change your audio connection. And there are three dots at the bottom of your screen, right next to the the circle with the red X. And you can click on that to get the option to switch audio, get a phone call, or call in. If you're having problems or technical issues during the webinar, please reach out to me, Christine Vanderland, via the chat. And if you have speakers as we go along, or questions for our speakers as we go along, please enter those into the Q&A. You might not see the Q&A right at the start, but if you navigate down to the bottom of the screen, there's three dots that you can click on and bring up the Q&A next to the chat. You are muted. This webinar is being recorded. At the end of the webinar, you will automatically see a pop-up 4-question survey, and we use your feedback to help plan future sessions and understand how well we met our objectives for today's webinar. So please do fill that out. And then if you're taking this webinar for training credit, you will receive an email following the event with that certificate of attendance. Sorry, my slides are kind of slow to advance. So to introduce a little bit about the Hudson River Estuary Program, we are a special program within the Department of Environmental Conservation, and we work throughout this green shaded area shown on your screen, which is the estuary watershed. So the estuary is the portion of the Hudson River that's under the influence of the tides. And all of the green shaded area are the lands that are draining to that portion of the Hudson River. Our mission is to protect, restore, and revitalize the Hudson River and its valley. And we work to ensure access for all to the Hudson. And we're working to achieve the key benefits that are listed on the slide. Within the estuary program, the conservation and land use team, which is the team that I am part of and which organized today's webinar, we work with municipalities on local land use and conservation planning. This is a shot of our website, which is a clearinghouse for information about local natural resource and conservation planning. And Ingrid just put the link to this website in the chat, so you can learn more about us. You also could reach out to me to learn more about our program or to talk about your interests in conservation planning in your community. This webinar and previous webinars are recorded, and we post the recordings online on this DEC webinar website. So following the webinar, you will receive an email with this link. It's also being posted now. So you can access this recording and then also previous webinars. We have an upcoming webinar on Tuesday, next Tuesday, November 14th, which is focused on municipal options for developing local funding sources for protecting open space. So we invite you to sign up and join us on Tuesday. The same link that was in the chat has a description of that webinar, and you can click through to a registration link too. So now I'm going to introduce our speakers today. So Ingrid Heckel is the newly promoted manager of DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program. Ingrid is overseeing the program's scientific research and outreach on water resource conservation, climate resilience, and conservation and land use in the estuary watershed. Prior to now, she worked as part of our conservation and land use team for 10 years, providing education and technical assistance to municipal and regional partners to promote conservation planning and protection. Ingrid began her career as a field biologist, mapping wetlands, streams, and other habitats in the Hudson Valley. And Emily Svensson is a partner in the law firm Gordon and Svensson in Poughkeepsie. Emily's legal practice focuses on environmental, land use, and municipal law. She serves several local municipalities as town attorney or planning board attorney and represents citizen groups and nonprofits advocating for environmental protection. Emily's background includes work in soil and water conservation and service as an elected town board member and deputy supervisor. So I'm going to invite Ingrid to share her slides and great.
Sorry, it took me a minute to find the unmute button. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you, Christine, for the introduction. My name is Ingrid Heckel, and I'll be presenting together with Emily Svensson about protecting wetlands and streams in your community. And this has been part of a series of programs we've been holding on this subject this fall. So hopefully, if you're here today, that means you haven't already attended one of our other sessions, but thanks for taking the time to join us. I'll be starting off the session with a brief introduction to the importance of wetlands and streams, including diversity, mapping, benefits, and threats. And Emily will take it from there to discuss the changing status of federal and state regulation of these resources and local approaches to wetland and stream protection. And lastly, I'll finish up with some additional training, tools, and funding available to develop local policy. Some of the messages we hope you'll take home today are that wetland and stream protection, including adjacent buffer areas, is really vital to clean water and many other benefits these areas provide. Existing mapping of wetlands and streams is incomplete and doesn't provide a reliable picture of all of the wetlands and streams that are around us, so you should do your homework and look more closely when you're reviewing proposed development projects. Thirdly, state and federal regulations are changing and they leave some big gaps. Fortunately, municipalities can do more, and we'll be talking about the various and diverse approaches that are available. And lastly, we hope you all come away realizing you can make a difference in your community or through your professional role to help bring awareness to the importance of these resources and advocate for their protection. So as we begin, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to think about a wetland or stream that you know, and it could be one you see regularly driving through your neighborhood or walking, um, or perhaps one you see around town or even on your own property. And as we go through the presentation, you can think about the type of wetland or stream it is, the benefits it provides, and whether and how it's protected at federal, state, and local levels. And so this is an example from my town in the heart of the village of New Paltz, and it's located right next to our village hall in Peace Park. It's a place I've driven by many times. There's a playground across the street. Haven't thought a whole lot about it, but this stream was actually buried in pipes for nearly 100 years. And then several years ago, the infrastructure was starting to break down, and the stream was unearthed or daylighted in 2016, in part from funding through a green infrastructure grant from the Hudson River Estuary Program. And this is my daughter's Girl Scout troop using this location for their moving up ceremony a few weeks ago, from daisies to brownies. And I think it's a great example both of the kind of small streams that are often unprotected at state and federal levels and overlooked in land development, that provide many ecological and other community benefits, such as this lovely example, uh, um, a community use. So I'll start with some definitions. A stream is simply a natural waterway flowing in a visible channel with a defined bed and banks. And generally we call larger streams rivers. It's important to note that streams are dynamic and they interact closely with their adjacent areas and floodplains, which are low-lying areas that periodically flood after heavy rainfall events and snowmelt. And those are also important parts of the stream system, even though they're normally dry most of the time. The riparian area is land bordering the stream or water body that is influenced by the presence of nearby surface and groundwater. And groundwater is usually shallow to the surface in these areas, and the vegetation and land uses in riparian areas have a strong influence on the hydrology and water quality in the adjacent stream. We'll also refer to riparian buffers or stream buffers, and these are protective areas of vegetation between a water body and human activity. And the same concept applies to wetland buffers as well. There are many different types of streams, but in this presentation, we're focusing on the basic distinction between perennial versus intermittent streams. Perennial streams flow year-round, whereas intermittent streams only flow seasonally or after rain. And the term ephemeral stream refers to very small intermittent streams that only flow after rainfall. Intermittent and ephemeral streams may be very small, but they contribute significantly to the quantity and quality of water in downstream rivers and water bodies. The EPA estimates that streams comprise nearly 60% of total stream length in the United States. However, in many cases, intermittent streams are unmapped. This is a map showing the town of Woodstock, New York, which happens to have high resolution local stream mapping that distinguishes perennial versus intermittent streams. So the perennial streams here are shown in blue versus purple for the intermittent. None of the intermittent streams shown here appear on state or federal stream maps, but they account for 67% of the stream length in this particular area. So moving on, wetlands have three main characteristics in common. Those are hydrology, soils, and vegetation. Water is present at or near the ground surface for a sufficient time during the growing season in a wetland to result in the development of hydric soil conditions and vegetation adapted to growing in saturated soils like the skunk cabbage shown here. And wetlands are extremely diverse, and truly no two wetlands are alike. However, we can classify wetlands into some common categories, such as these, based on vegetation characteristics and hydrology. Knowing the type of wetland you have can help determine the plant and animal species that might occur there. And one key message to take away is that not all wetlands are wet all the time. They can be wet only seasonally, but still be wetlands. And in addition, I'll just note we have tidal wetlands along the Hudson River that are influenced by daily tidal fluctuations, as well as the salinity gradient, which Christine mentioned in the estuary. We're not going to focus on those in this presentation. We'll be discussing non-tidal wetlands. So I'll briefly walk you through these different wetland types. Swamps are wetlands that are dominated by trees and shrubs. And contrary to their depiction in popular culture, they're really wonderful habitats. Forested swamps have a closed tree canopy, but we also have shrub swamps, which can be more open. Swamps vary widely in the degree of flooding or soil saturation. So some can have standing water for many months or nearly all year round, whereas others may only have saturated soils for several weeks during the growing season, but a sufficient period of time to develop, again, those distinctive soils and vegetation. Woodland pools are a subset of vernal pools, and they are small, isolated, seasonally flooded wetlands. And because they're isolated from streams and they usually dry up by the middle of the summer, they lack fish. And as a result, they're often vital breeding grounds for salamanders and frogs and other, those are important forest-dwelling amphibians. They're often quite small, and as a result, these wetlands often don't show up on official maps. Wet meadows occur in many cases in abandoned agricultural areas and are dominated by grasses and forbs. In some cases, these are areas that were previously drained for farming and have returned to wetlands after farming activity has stopped. In this picture, you can see purple loosestrife in the background. That's a non-native invasive species that's really common in these habitats and is also a good indicator of wet soils. Next, we have marshes, and these typically have standing water throughout most of the growing season. They're dominated by herbaceous vegetation like cattails, and these are probably what you think of first when you hear the word wetland. So our picture book wetland. And lastly, we have open water habitats like ponds and lakes. These are usually flooded year round. They can support a wide variety of aquatic plants. And it's important to note that many of our ponds and lakes were created by impounding streams or excavating other types of wetlands to make them deeper, which continues to happen. People continue to do this. While ponds have some good habitat values, the best practice ecologically is to avoid altering existing wetlands. See? So similarly to the issues with stream maps, um, state and federal wetland maps are very incomplete. This map shows that there's one DEC mapped wetland near the center of Woodstock in our study area here, and that has this light green check zone around it that the state includes with the freshwater wetland maps because we know they're pretty inaccurate. There are also a handful of other small wetlands shown in dark green here that are picked up by the National Wetland Inventory mapping. However, in reality, there are numerous other small wetlands present. These are shown in pink that are picked up by the local Woodstock habitat map. And in particular, we know that smaller, drier wetlands are frequently missed in the National Wetland Inventory database, as well as our state wetland maps. Oopsie. I'm sorry, this keeps jumping around. So next I'm going to talk briefly about the functions and benefits of wetlands and streams. And this is a diagram showing the overview of wetland functions and relationship with surrounding landscape. Water typically enters wetlands through streams and surface water runoff, or sometimes by groundwater discharging to the surface. And as water enters a wetland, it slows down and spreads out and can be released more slowly downstream, which reduces erosion and flooding. And in the process, sediment and nutrients are filtered from the water, and many contaminants can be broken down by bacteria or taken up by plants in the wetland, so that the water draining out of wetlands is usually cleaner than the water that entered. And intermittent streams and other small streams provide many similar functions, controlling sediment and nutrient runoff to larger streams. They're particularly important for nutrient processing, which can reduce excess nitrogen from polluting downstream waters and causing related impacts like algal blooms. So this diagram shows the hyporheic zone, which is an area of sediment and porous space beneath the stream bed, where there's shallow mixing of groundwater and surface water from the stream. And this is where a lot of water filtration and purification occurs, as well as groundwater recharge. So you can imagine when streams are buried or have their channels altered, we're losing these important water quality and recharge functions, and all that water is just moving even faster downstream, which can contribute to flooding. An intact network of wetlands and streams provides many significant benefits for flood control. A single acre of wetlands can store up to 1.5 million gallons of floodwater. And natural stream corridors and floodplains also they provide the space that streams need during floods to spread out and slow down water. And we know this is increasingly important in our changing climate. As climate warms, we're not only receiving more overall precipitation per year, but more of it is occurring in heavy downpour type events that result in flooding. And for example, like the July 10th floods we experienced this past summer. This is an image from Highland Falls on that date. Protecting small wetlands and streams and avoiding new development in these areas reduces risk to our communities and infrastructure, and it's one of the most cost-effective strategies we have to mitigate flood risk and damage. So moving on to some other benefits, wetlands and streams provide critical habitat for many common and imperiled species. These are just a few examples. About 40% of plant and animal species live or breed in wetlands, and about half of federally threatened and endangered species are wetland dependent. It's important to recognize that critical habitat extends beyond the wetland or stream itself. There are many species that move between habitats throughout the year to meet their needs, like the spotted salamander shown here, which breeds in woodland pools and lives the remainder of the year in the surrounding forest. And they can travel for up to a mile away from these pools. Buffers also protect the quality of the habitat from adjacent land uses. So buffers or riparian areas provide numerous important functions. They help to slow down runoff and reduce erosion. They filter out nutrients and sediment before they reach the aquatic habitat. They control flooding, provide shade that helps keep streams cool, the water in streams cool, and they contribute organic matter and wood that are vital to the in-stream or wetland habitat. So you may have heard the term that fish grow on trees because they rely on the shade, the food, and the habitat that trees provide to streams. It's a very reciprocal relationship between the riparian area and the stream. And anyone who likes to fish, for example, for trout, probably has quickly learned to look for this kind of woody structure in streams because that's often where fish like to hide out. There's a lot of research around recommended buffer widths to protect streams and wetlands, and in general, the bigger the better. This graphic, which is from the Planner's Guide to Wetland Buffers, illustrates buffer widths needed to achieve different goals based on scientific literature. So for example, a buffer of between 30 and 100 feet may be sufficient for sediment and phosphorus removal from runoff into a stream or wetland, but you may need up to 160 feet or more for nitrogen removal, or up to 300 feet or more for wildlife habitat protection. In general, the literature recommends at least a 100-foot buffer along streams to achieve most of these benefits. And the last thing I'll touch on in this introduction are some of the common threats to these resources, specifically threats related to local land use. Vegetation clearing, filling, grading, these continue to be common plights of small wetlands to make way for new development. And similarly, small streams are often channelized or buried in pipes. Development in wetlands continues to be a leading cause of wetland loss in the Hudson Valley, and this is an example of an apartment complex that was partially constructed on top of a wetland. See. And lastly, excess and polluted runoff from new development can impact nearby streams and wetlands. And we don't have time to go in detail into stormwater management in this webinar, but it's an important and closely related topic. So with that, I'll stop sharing and Emily will continue into the next part of our webinar.
Okay, thanks, Ingrid. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, that looks great.
Terrific. All right, thanks everyone for being here. My name again is Emily Spenson. I'm an attorney in Poughkeepsie. And the next segments of our webinar today, I'm going to be talking about state jurisdiction over streams and wetlands and federal jurisdiction over some streams and wetlands, and then also talk about what local governments can do. I want to point out that the slides that I'm going through have a lot of information, and the entire slideshow, Ingrid's and mine, will be sent to you after the presentation through your email. So you don't have to try to write things down. You'll get the slides. And also we made a fact sheet that covers the key points of what we're covering, and you'll have a link to that as well. So rest assured you'll have some materials for your own reference and to share with others after the presentation. And I want to also just reiterate what Ingrid said. Our focus today is on physical disturbance of streams and wetlands during construction activities. There are lots of other things that can affect water quality and such that are outside the scope of today. So we're really just focused in on physical disturbance of those resources. Okay, so just to put us all in the same frame of mind here, I want to just remind folks where laws come from, right? So what we typically call laws are statutes, and those statutes are adopted by legislatures, state legislatures, the federal government, Congress. They adopt laws, and then the laws are carried out by agencies, and agencies produce regulations and guidance and things like that to actually carry out those statutes. And then if there are issues or disputes, they may go to the courts. And so just kind of keeping that framework in mind will explain some of the flux that's happening as far as federal and state wetland regulations. So I'm going to start with New York State regulations. The reason I'm starting with New York State is because for the most part, they're the stronger set of regulations. Occasionally people think that if something is a federal wetland, that must mean it's highly regulated, but the federal regulations tend to not be as strong as the state ones. So we're going to start with New York State. New York State, and we're going to start with streams within New York State regulations. So New York State stream regulation arises from the Protection of Waters statute, which is part of the Environmental Conservation Law, which regulates the physical disturbance of streams. And that regulation is based on a map that the state has produced and a classification system of the streams. So streams that are mapped and classified as AA, A, B, and some Cs, only the CT and the CTS, those are the regulated streams. The regular C that doesn't have a T with it, C are not regulated and the D are not regulated under the Protection of Waters program. For the most part, these are perennial streams, meaning they flow year round. There are occasionally intermittent streams that are mapped and classified, and then those would also be regulated. But for the most part, they're the perennial year-round flowing streams. And if you come across a stream that is unmapped, if it is a perennial year-round stream, then it will be regulated, even though it's not mapped, and it will take the classification of the stream it flows into. So I guess just to clarify that, if it flows into a regulated stream, then it will be regulated. If it's an unmapped perennial stream that flows into an unregulated stream, a C or D, then it will not be regulated. So to provide an example of that, you'll see here the blue highlighted stream, and actually the part that it flows continues through down to the Hudson River. That is a class CT stream, meaning it's a class C with a T, a trout designation. And so that stream is regulated. If a project were proposed that disturbed that stream, it would be regulated. It would need a DEC permit through New York State. Just to the left of that, you'll see the Landsman Kill stream system. That is a class C that is not a T. So it's just a regular C, and that means it's not regulated. So it's a perfectly nice stream. It flows through a nice forested area. Development that affects that stream would not be regulated by New York State. So it's really just depends on that classification system. So for streams that are regulated, then the question is what part of the stream area is regulated? And the area regulated is the bed and banks of the stream. The bed is the area that's actually underwater most of the time. It's the bed of the stream up to the mean high water level. And then the banks of the stream are the area that slopes down toward the stream up to a maximum of 50 feet. Occasionally it can be more than 50 feet if it's steeper than 45 degrees, but for the most part, it's just the bed and the banks up to a maximum of 50 feet. So that's the area regulated by New York State. It doesn't really provide a buffer to the level that Ingrid was speaking about. The area that is part of the stream ecosystem may extend beyond that. And then, so for each of these categories, we're going to tell you about what's regulated and then what's changing. In the case of streams, that's easy because New York State regulation of streams is not changing. There have been some attempts to change the statute to expand to all Class C streams, but they have not yet been enacted. So at this point, it's what I just described, and that's staying the same. So moving on to New York State regulation of wetlands. Wetlands are regulated through the Freshwater Wetlands Act. And New York State at the moment today regulates wetlands that are 12.4 acres or larger based on regulatory maps that they have established. So for a wetland to be regulated, it has to be 12.4 acres or larger, and it has to be identified on the state regulatory maps. Occasionally, smaller wetlands of unusual local importance can also be regulated. I'm not going to dwell on this because it's changing, as we're going to get to in a moment. So the area that's regulated includes the wetland itself and a 100-foot adjacent area adjacent to the edge of the wetland. And there's a DEC permitting program that exists. So if an applicant or if someone wants to do construction within that area, they can apply for a permit from New York State. So this is an area where there is a lot of change coming, and this is one of the things we wanted to alert you to, and the reason for doing these programs. So the state legislature amended the statute in 2022. And the new regulations are underway, and so there will be changes rolling out over the next few years. So just to kind of clarify, the statute was changed, but the changes to the regulations are still underway. So the regulations are going to be coming out in draft form in the next couple of months, we're expecting. And so if these are issues that are important to you and your community, you can keep an eye out for the draft regulations, and it'll be an opportunity to comment if there are things that you want to urge the state to include in the final regulations. So the statute change did, though, give direction to what those changes are going to be, and that's what we're going to go over right now. So the first set of changes that will take effect in 2025, jurisdiction will no longer be based on maps. So if the jurisdiction will still be 12.4 acres or larger, but it will not be based on a map. So that if you have a wetland on a site that's 12.4 acres or larger, but was not previously mapped by DEC, in the past, that was very difficult. They were not able to regulate that. But under the regulations that will be taking effect in 2025, wetlands 12.4 acres or larger will be regulated whether or not they appear on a map. The other change that will take place in 2025 is that there will be new criteria for small wetlands of unusual importance. So some of the criteria that will apply to unusual importance include watersheds with flooding issues, wetlands in urban areas, wetlands that provide habitat for protected species, vernal pools specifically, and previously mapped wetlands that were regulated in the past will also continue, even if they're smaller than 12.4 acres. So the regulations that we're waiting to see in the next couple of months will provide more clarity on that. But the upshot is that there will be more categories of wetlands that will be included, even if they're smaller than 12.4 acres. But I do want to emphasize that there's still going to be only wetlands of unusual importance that are regulated by DEC if they're smaller than 12.4 acres. So there are lots of usual types of importance that Ingrid just described, and not all of those wetlands are going to be regulated by New York State. The next set of changes that will be happening in 2028 is that the size threshold will reduce to 7.4 acres instead of 12.4. So those wetlands that are 7.4 acres and larger will become regulated in 2028. And a note about the maps, even though mapping will no longer be the determination of whether something is regulated or not, DEC is not going to be abandoning their mapping. In fact, they're going to be putting effort into improving the available maps, and they will be taking input from local government and academia and such to improve those maps as a predictive tool for where wetlands are likely to be. They just won't be they won't be the decision-making factor on what's jurisdictional. Okay, so that's New York State regulation of streams and wetlands. Moving on now to federal regulation of streams and wetlands. Federal regulation of disturbance or placement of fill in streams and wetlands comes under the Clean Water Act, Section 404. And the Clean Water Act applies to waters of the United States. And we're going to be talking more about what is a water of the United States, because that is what determines whether there is federal jurisdiction. There is no regulatory map for federal streams and wetland jurisdiction. You may have seen the National Wetland Inventory maps. Those are a great predictive tool to see where wetlands may be, but that map is not a regulatory map. It doesn't mean that if something's on there or not on there, it does not affect whether or not it's regulated. The key to federal jurisdiction is connectedness. So the waters of the United States, the Clean Water Act is based on the Federal Commerce Clause. And so you can kind of picture a web of waterways, starting with navigable rivers and then branching out to streams and then wetlands that are adjacent to those streams. That's what's going to be regulated. It's not going to be anything that's isolated, because it's based on this idea of interstate commerce. So to give a little more detail on that, actually first, I want to mention that for wetlands that are regulated, there is a permitting system. So if someone wants to construct something that will affect a federally regulated wetland, there is a permitting system. And there are a lot of, there are general permits available, which can allow a certain amount of wetland disturbance for common project types. So for instance, there's a general permit that allows disturbance of up to a ½ acre of wetland loss for residential housing construction, for instance. So there's quite a lot of availability of permits through the Army Corps of Engineers, which is who implements Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. So that I just want folks to bear in mind that just because a wetland may be regulated or jurisdictional under the federal government, it doesn't mean that it's protected per se, because of the availability of these permits that can pretty easily be received in order to fill parts of a wetland. Okay, so going back to the question, which are these waters of the United States that are regulated by the federal government? So it includes navigable waters, and then tributaries of those rivers, the streams that are tributary, and then wetlands that are adjacent to those rivers and streams. And the question of what adjacent means has caused a lot of conflict over the last couple decades. And different rules have come out. Most recently in March 2023, a rule came out from the EPA, which is who makes the rules about waters of the United States. And then, like, no sooner had that rule gone into effect that in May 2023, the US Supreme Court Sackett decision came out, which invalidated the March 2023 rule. So in August 2023, the federal government came out with a new conforming rule to conform to the Sackett decision. So there's a new rule as of August 2023. And so if you had heard in the past about the significant nexus rule, that's no longer a thing. So I'm going to tell you what the rule is now, which came out in the August 2023 regulation. And the Army Corps is still, so again, EPA made the rule about what's the water of the United States. Army Corps actually implements the Section 404 permit program. And Army Corps is still kind of waiting for more guidance on how to implement this. So we don't have the exact details for you, but want to kind of give you the gist. So what the new rule is that tributaries that are relatively permanent are included in federal jurisdiction. So that definitely includes perennial streams that flow year round. It definitely does not include ephemeral streams that flow only after rainstorms, those really small temporary streams. It may include some intermittent streams. So if a stream is seasonal, it may fall into the category of relatively permanent, or it may not. And we can't really tell you right now where that line will be drawn. As far as wetlands have to have a continuous surface connection to one of those regulated rivers or streams. So that means that isolated wetlands that are not connected to a stream are not regulated by the federal government. This question, again, is still unrolling. It may not be over. There have been attempts to adopt new statutes, so we'll see. But again, I do want to emphasize that these changes at the federal level do not affect New York State regulation, because New York State has its own statutes that were adopted separately. So the upshot of all of this is that New York State is expanding its protection of streams and wetlands, while the federal government is reducing its jurisdiction. The changes that I just mentioned to the federal regulations, EPA has estimated that those changes reduced jurisdiction nationwide by eliminating jurisdiction over 1 to 5 million miles of ephemeral streams and reducing jurisdiction of up to 63% of wetlands by acreage. So it's a pretty significant reduction in federal jurisdiction. I have a couple slides here to try to illustrate that change. So this slide shows a traditional navigable water like a river, then the tributaries to it that are perennial, that flow year round, they will be regulated by the federal government, and wetlands that are adjacent to those tributaries will be regulated. Tributaries that are intermittent may or may not be regulated. And then wetlands that are adjacent, if it's a regulated tributary, adjacent wetlands that are have a continuous surface connection will be regulated. But isolated wetlands will never be regulated by the federal government. And this slide I wanted for you to have for reference, but we're not going to get into the details. So I wanted to provide an example of the permitting that I spoke about. So this is an example of a site where there are state regulated wetlands over on the left side, and a pond, and then there are some smaller wetlands that may have had federal jurisdiction. And I'm going to zoom in on one area. So the area that's shown in orange, that was mapped by the applicant as a potential federal jurisdiction stream and wetland area. And what I wanted to show is that when an applicant is designing a site, if they see a wetland where the only regulation of it is federal, they may be aware that it's quite easy to get permitting to disturb a small amount of that wetland. So in this case, it looks kind of like the project designer didn't really try to avoid that stream. They put two crossings across it to get to an area where they wanted to build, and they were easily able to get a permit for that. And I wanted to show the outcome. On the left, you see an aerial photo before the project went in. It's a forested area with that stream and wetland area. Afterwards, the area all around it has been clear cut, and only a few trees left right around the wetland area. So I just want to emphasize that if a wetland or a stream is under federal jurisdiction, don't count on that to provide any real ecological protection. Whatever habitat value that had really is probably much less, if not gone at this point, after all the vegetation has been removed, because there's no buffer around a federal wetland. Okay, so I want to try to put all those pieces together. This is going back to that mapping that Ingrid showed in the town of Woodstock. This colorful map shows all the different areas that the town found to be streams and wetlands when they did their own mapping. New York State stream regulations only cover those red streams that have been mapped and classified. New York State wetlands regulations include one wetland in this area, the one covered, shown in red here, and the 100-foot buffer around it. Federal regulations, we can't really say for sure. They definitely include some of the streams in this area, and they include the wetlands that are adjacent to those streams. They're shown in red on this map. They may include some additional streams and wetlands depending on how those definitions of a relatively permanent stream and a continuous surface connection wetland play out. But there are also definitely some wetlands that are not connected to any stream that will certainly not be covered by federal regulation. In 2025, when the New York State regulations change, one new wetland will come into state jurisdiction because it's greater than 12.4 acres. Even though it's not currently mapped, the one circled there will come into state jurisdiction. And in 2028, when the New York State threshold goes down to 7.4 acres, a few more wetlands will come into state jurisdiction. Okay, this is the audience participation portion of the presentation. So I'm going to ask, if you look at the bottom of your screen, hopefully you have a chat function. And now the question is, can I find the chat function while I'm sharing my screen? So let's give this a try. I'm going to go through a few examples and see if you guys can put in the chat what you think the state or federal jurisdiction is of these wetlands. So the site that we're looking at is a large site. It's an 800-acre site where there's been consideration of some development, and they have had detailed habitat mapping done. So the map that you see here is a Hudsonia habitat map that shows streams, wetlands, and other habitat types. And so we're going to run through a few examples. The first area circled in orange is a stream corridor with a wetlands complex along the stream. The stream is a perennial stream. It's mapped by New York State, and it's a Class C stream. And the wetlands along it include swamps and wet meadows, and the wetlands have not been mapped as a state protected wetland. So my first question is this stream covered by New York State regulations? You can just type it into the chat if you think you know. And I'm going to try to find the chat. Let's see.
If you cannot see it, I can see it. I'm seeing answers come in, Emily, so I can read them out if you don't see it.
Okay, no, I think I just found it actually. I just
Great.
had to click on some things. All right, terrific. Good. So, right, this stream is not regulated by New York State because it's perennial, it's mapped, but it's a Class C. It's not a CT. So that will not be New York State regulated stream. The wetlands along the stream, are they regulated by New York State? No, that's correct. They're not, because they are not mapped as state regulated wetlands. But they may be in 2025 if they add up to 12.4 contiguous acres, which they may. So we will see. As far as federal regulation, is this stream, which is it's a perennial stream again, do we think this stream is under federal jurisdiction? The answer is actually yes, because this federal jurisdiction is not based on mapping. It's just based on whether it's a relatively permanent stream, which it is. So there is federal jurisdiction over this stream, and the wetlands that are connected to this stream, would they have federal jurisdiction? Yes, that's right. Good. So the wetlands that are connected to the stream would also be under federal jurisdiction. Let's see. Next example is some isolated wetlands that are in the forested part of the site. They include buttonbush pools, intermittent woodland pools, intermittent swamps, but they have no connection to any stream. So would those wetlands be regulated by New York State under the current regulations? Right. So the answer is no, they're not regulated right now by New York State because they're not on a state wetlands map and they're smaller than 12.4 acres. In 2025, when the rules change, it's possible that they might come under that unusual importance category because they may have important species there and vernal pools are supposed to become protected. So they may. What about federal jurisdiction over those isolated wetlands? No, correct. Yeah, we're all pretty sure about that one. So they're not connected to a stream, no federal jurisdiction. Next example, there's some wet meadows in a former agricultural field. They add up to maybe 4 or 5 acres altogether, not connected to a stream. So would there be state jurisdiction on those wetlands? No, there wouldn't be. And it's unlikely that there would be under any of the upcoming changes either. What about federal jurisdiction over those wetlands, the wet meadows? Right, I'm seeing lots of no's. So that's correct. There would not be because they're not connected to a stream. Last example, this is an intermittent stream that flows into that perennial stream we were talking about. This intermittent stream has some wetlands adjacent to it, which include marshes and wet meadows. The stream nor the wetlands, neither has been mapped by New York State as jurisdictional. So right now, is that stream under New York State jurisdiction? No, correct. It's not mapped, classified, and it's not perennial. And then are those wetlands under New York State jurisdiction? No, they're not. They're not mapped by the state, and it's unlikely that they would be under state jurisdiction in the future because they probably don't have a contiguous 12.4 acres. I don't know. They may be. I don't know enough about those wetlands to say if they would meet one of the unusual categories. As far as federal jurisdiction, again, if someone asked, how do we know by looking at this picture if they're mapped? You don't know that, but you can look at the text over on the side where I said whether they are or not, because we did check that. So federal jurisdiction on this, I'm just going to say is a big maybe, because we don't know whether that stream is permanent enough to be relatively permanent, and we don't know if the stream is jurisdictional, then the wetlands adjacent to it would also be, but we just don't know that. Okay, thanks for playing along. I appreciate it. It helps to know that people are absorbing the material. All right, we're gonna keep
Emily?
going. Yeah.
Can I pose a couple clarifying questions people asked before we
Yes.
go into the next section? One, if a stream flows into a Class A water supply lake, is it regulated?
Stream flows into a Class A water supply lake. If so, the state stream regulations are based on the state stream mapping. So the first place to look would be the maps to see if the stream is mapped. If it's mapped, if it's mapped and it's classified as Class CT or higher, then it's regulated. I'm assuming the reason the person is asking is that it's unmapped. And if it's unmapped, then it depends. If it's perennial, it may be regulated. I can talk to this person offline if we want to get into the specifics, but hopefully that helps.
Okay. And another question, what, if you can, is an example of a wetland of unusual importance? Would it be in, say, an EJ area? Would it have listed species habitat?
Right. So that is the statute gave the changed statute gave some direction on that, and we'll find out the specifics when the regulations come out for comment. So I would encourage the person to look at those regulations when they come out, and if they want to comment on it, they can. Some of the clues that the state gave in the statute is there were a number of categories listed, including wetlands in a watershed with flooding problems, wetlands in urban areas, wetlands that provide habitat for rare species, certain vernal pools. So more to come on that as the regulations are finalized.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for jumping in, Christine. Okay, so the last segment here for me, and then I want to leave time for Ingrid's last segment as well. We're hopefully a lot of folks here on the webinar are part of a local municipality, and you do have a lot of opportunity within your municipalities to develop your own regulations. What we're hoping that you've seen from the previous segments is that there are a lot of streams and wetlands that are not regulated by either the state or federal government. And even if they are, they may not be fully protected by those agencies because permits are fairly readily available, at least for federal jurisdictional areas. So, and also just from what Ingrid described, you'll notice that the wetlands that are more important aren't necessarily the ones that are regulated. There may be wetlands that provide really important benefits that just don't happen to fall into one of those categories that are regulated by the state or federal government. So the good news is that you have the opportunity to make your own regulations. So the benefits of creating your own municipal regulations are not relying on those state and federal regulations, and you can choose what's important in your community and make regulations that suit your needs. Municipalities have that authority, both generally under New York State General Municipal or New York State Municipal Home Rule Law, Section 10, as well as the New York State Freshwater Wetlands Act specifically says that the state knows that they're not regulating all the wetlands, and they offer municipalities the option to regulate smaller unregulated wetlands. So I like to suggest to folks that if you're thinking about, if you want to take a look at what you have in your community and improve your protection of streams and wetlands, the first place to look is to see what regulations you already have in place and find out if they're being implemented, or if not, if that is something that you can work on. So, for example, do you have regulations in your zoning code, and is the planning board fully embracing those regulations when they review site plans and subdivisions? If not, maybe that's an opportunity for education and process change. Also, is your code enforcement officer up to speed on what they should be doing if someone disturbs wetlands in your community? If you have a regulation, is the code enforcement officer aware of it and how they should be enforcing it? Sometimes code enforcement officers are amazingly well-versed on everything to do with fire codes and such, but may not have a background in environmental protection. So that's an opportunity. But then if you determine that you don't have the regulations that you need within your community to protect streams and wetlands, I like to suggest, a problem-solving approach of thinking about which resources are important and what the threats are to those resources, so that you're focusing your effort on the actual concerns in your community and not doing something overbroad that will be a challenge for you. So think about really what the problem is you're trying to solve, and then what strategy might work, which we'll talk about in a moment. And I would also just suggest considering the political will in your community and the enforcement capacity. So if you're in a small town that doesn't have a lot of capacity to enforce, say, conservation easements, then that might not be something that's going to work well for you. So just think about what's going to work for you. So the first example of a type of stream and wetland protection is sort of the gold standard wetland and watercourse protection law. This type of law provides comprehensive regulation of not only new construction, but also other types of activities in and near streams and wetlands. So if you design a wetland and watercourse protection law, you can choose which areas to regulate. You can include streams, wetlands, vernal pools, anything that is important in your community. And then you can choose what size buffer you want to protect around those regulated resources. You can also set up a permitting process for if development does need to occur in those areas. And that you can also set your own penalties if you want for what will happen if someone violates that law. An example of a wetland and watercourse protection law is the town of Woodstock. So we were using this example throughout the presentation of a section of the town of Woodstock. And you could see there were certain streams and wetlands that were not regulated by either the state or federal government. But the good news is that the town of Woodstock has a comprehensive wetland and watercourse protection law, which applies to wetlands of all sizes, vernal pools, streams, and water bodies. It includes a buffer of 30 to 100 feet, depending on the resource. I want to just talk about that for a minute. As Ingrid showed, the buffer size that you need depends on what you're trying to protect, but usually 100 feet is a good buffer size to go for. They may have decided in their process that it wasn't, I don't know the details of Woodstock's process, but for instance, some communities find that asking for 100-foot buffer around all streams and wetlands is just not viable, that it won't get passed in their community. Well, okay, so if you can get 30 feet past, that's doing something, right? So sometimes it's just a compromise. Their wetland and watercourse protection law requires permits for various activities, and they have a wetland and watercourse inspector who helps to implement the law. Now, what if you're not ready to do a full wetland and watercourse protection law, or what if maybe you already have one, but you want to add some other layers of protection? So I'm going to talk about some other alternatives if that isn't the right choice for your community. One example is zoning setbacks. So, you have setbacks from the lot lines, for instance, different types of setback requirements. You could add a setback from streams or wetlands. And what the town of Gardner had, and I think they're in the process of changing this, but what they have had is they had a rule in their code that said for state regulated streams, we're adding an extra 100-foot setback from the top of the bank. So whatever area New York State regulates, the town of Gardner is adding a 100-foot extra buffer of protection, because again, the state protects the bed and bank of the stream only up to 50 feet. And 50 feet really isn't much of a buffer. So the town of Gardner decided we're not going to identify new streams for protection, but we are going to add a buffer on state regulated streams. That's adding something. And this is a photo of an area where there was development proposed along the Shawangunk Kill, and the state regulated area only went a little ways up the slope, but the town's regulation added an extra 100-foot setback, keeping the development back further from the river. Another option is the use of overlay zoning. Overlay zoning is where you create regulations that add an extra layer of protection on top of the existing underlying zoning. So this first example is from the city of Newburgh. They created a waterfront protection overlay district that applies to the Hudson River and some of the major stream corridors. You could kind of see the blue dotted lines there. And so in the areas within that overlay district, if it doesn't mean that you can't develop there, but in those areas, in addition to the regular zoning rules, there's an extra set of regulations to protect those water bodies. Another use of overlay zoning is if there are certain watershed areas or broad areas that need protection. This is in the town of Newcastle, and on the left and the right side of the town, the sort of tan shaded areas, both of those areas are watersheds that drain into two different drinking water systems. And so in those areas, the town wanted to put an extra layer of protection on the wetlands that occur within those parts of town. So if a project is proposed within one of those, within the environmental protection overlay area, it has the regular zoning requirements, but then it also has an extra set of wetlands protections in those areas. So they weren't ready to do or didn't see the need to do expanded wetlands protections townwide, but they did want to have expanded wetlands protections in areas that drain to the drinking water sources. Another example is the use of a conservation planning process. So you may have conservation subdivisions in your subdivision code. The idea there is to arrange the lots or the homes on a site in a way that best protects the natural resources on the site, while still allowing the developer to have the full number of houses that they otherwise would have. So this example is from the town of Pine Plains. Their conservation subdivision process actually is required in rural districts. Sometimes conservation subdivision is an option, but in the town of Pine Plains, it's a required process in the rural zoning district. And what they require is that the applicant and the board have to agree to the conservation area before laying out the development. So the applicant will come in with all of the natural resources mapped, including streams and wetlands, as well as other important natural areas. And the applicant and the board will agree together on the certain areas that need to be protected versus the areas where development can occur. And that all happens before anyone draws out any houses on the plan. And this resource, this guide that's available through New York State provides a great resource on all different kinds of model laws that you can choose from that might work in your community. There's no concern about plagiarism. If you find a law that you like that someone else is using, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery when it comes to laws. So go ahead and use it and adapt it and make use of other people's work to benefit your community. Okay. I want to spend just a minute on seeker. So the seeker process, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, that's obviously a state regulation, but it's something that's carried out in individual communities by boards. I imagine many folks watching are board members who do seeker on projects in their community. So I want to just urge you to use seeker as a tool to protect streams and wetlands. The first thing I want to point out is that seeker is not limited to regulated resources. So if seeker is asked, the question that it's basically asking is, does this project pose the potential for any significant adverse environmental impacts? And that doesn't ask significant impacts to regulated resources. It just asks whether there are any significant environmental impacts. So if there are streams or wetlands on a site that are not regulated, they're still part of your seeker consideration. Couple ways to make your seeker process more effective. One thing you can do is collect data in advance, because that if an applicant comes in and says, we're not aware of any streams or wetlands on the site, if you have already done proactive data collection, like this example is from the town of Hyde Park, where a sensitive part of the town was proactively mapped in partnership with Hudsonia. If a project came in this area, the town would already know where there are known to be streams and wetlands and could ensure that the applicant does a careful job of identifying those. So being proactive is definitely helpful. If you can't do actual mapping like this, even just collecting and knowing all the resources available on online mappers and such can be a helpful tool. Also make sure that your officials and the consultants that you hire are educated on the local resources and the priorities that you have in your community. So for example, they know that you are concerned about protecting streams or wetlands. And another option is the use of critical environmental areas to document key areas that you want to make sure are protected. And I won't get into that in detail, but I think there are some resources on the in the tools that we'll give you later. And just my final pitch here is that to consider different layers of protection. It's not just choosing one tool, but you may need different tools to really protect the water resources in your community. And if you are in the process, for instance, of doing comprehensive planning, one of the best things you can do is look at your whole community and say, okay, we want to protect our water resources, but we know we also need housing, or we need different types of growth. Where do we want those things to occur? And really plan that out so that you're not having arguments on individual sites. So this example is in the town of Red Hook, where they decided they really wanted to keep their agricultural and forested areas rural, as well as their Hudson River waterfront. They didn't want to have heavy development there, but they did want to incorporate more dense development adjacent to the village of Red Hook. And so they zoned for that, and they put in infrastructure for that so that they could have the housing that they knew they needed, while also keeping the pressure off some of the more sensitive ecological areas. So if you're a planning board member, for instance, what are some things that you can do? You can use the local laws that are available in your community. And if you feel that the local laws you have are not adequate, then you can advocate for your town board, village board, city council to adopt stronger local laws. You can also use seeker to on individual sites to look at the resources and how any impacts to them can be mitigated. And if you're working on a site that does have potentially federally or state jurisdictional wetlands, make sure those are mapped. Make sure the mapping is validated with DEC. Send the applicant to the Army Corps for a jurisdictional determination if needed, and make sure that those resources are really being protected. I think that brings me to the end of my slides. I'm going to turn it back to Ingrid, but I do want to just really thank all of you for your interest and your attention, and do feel free to reach out if you have more questions. Looking for how to end my screen sharing here, Ingrid. Let's see.
You're all set. Ingrid took over.
Great.
Yeah, I think I figured that one out. Here I am. Right. Thank you so much, Emily. That was really great. So I'll just take a few final minutes to provide some information about additional training, tools, and funding available on this topic. If you're interested in learning more about the changing state wetland regulations, we're hosting a webinar on December 14th that will go further in depth on that topic. We do know there's a chance this webinar may be postponed. The regulatory rulemaking process has been delayed already. We were hoping to originally offer this webinar in October, so things seem to have been delayed, but please register if you're interested. If it is postponed, then you'll be notified of the new date. In addition, we have a great archive of past webinar recordings on these topics, including about headwater stream conservation and wetland and vernal pool conservation and more, including more in-depth training about how to remotely identify and map some of these features that may not show up on existing maps. And if you're not already signed up for our DEC Delivers e-newsletter list, you can do that on the webpage with the webinar registration, and make sure you're getting announcements. The Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper is an online interactive mapping tool from the DEC that is a very useful resource for existing stream and wetland mapping. And it also includes wetland related soil maps that can help to identify additional potential wetland locations. Please take advantage of that. These are, it's a nice handy reference. If your community may also happen to have a natural resources inventory or other local studies which provide local mapping data on wetlands and streams. And this is an example from the town of Washington, which we're currently assisting. This map includes local wetland and stream mapping from a habitat mapping study in the town that includes vernal pools and also includes those wetland soils and state jurisdictional wetlands. Emily touched on the Department of State and DEC model local laws to increase resilience, and this includes a large chapter on wetland and watercourse protection measures with many examples from diverse New York communities, and that's available on the Department of State website. That's a great resource. And we wanted to throw in a couple of other publications that we think are useful, including the Planner's Guide to Wetland Buffers for local governments. And this blue publication is a recent study about wetland and watercourse regulations profiling 3 Hudson Valley towns, including New Paltz, Fishkill, and Newcastle, that provides an in-depth analysis of factors leading to the successful adoption and implementation of these laws. That's a really interesting study. And we also have our website, which is a clearinghouse of resources, as Christine mentioned in the introduction. And we have some fact sheets that we put together on these topics. So if you wanted to share some of these, highlights of what we've discussed today with other members of your board or a group you're in, you can print these off. They're fact sheets for wetland and stream conservation, as well as a really nice overview of the changing state and federal regulatory changes on the right. And if you're interested in developing local policy, there's funding available through Hudson River Estuary grants and also from the Hudson River Valley Greenway. And these grants can be used to fund professional assistance for zoning revisions, wetland and water course laws, or conservation overlay zoning. And the map on the right is from a conservation overlay zoning project underway in 5 Westchester towns and villages to protect water quality in the Croton Gorge area, and that's funded through an estuary grant. And lastly, the Hudson River Estuary Trees for Tribs program helps streamside landowners and municipalities to protect and restore stream buffers by providing free trees and shrubs and assistance with plantings. And municipalities and other partners can really help us to spread the word with property owners about this program. And some have been involved with restoring stream buffers on municipal parks or other municipally owned land, like this example. So I'll stop there, and thank you again for listening today. And we have a few minutes left to take some questions.
Thank you both, Ingrid and Emily. We do have a couple of questions. One question is whether municipalities need to go to the effort of mapping all their wetlands in order to regulate them, or can they rely on informational online maps and then put the burden on applicants and wetland delineators in terms of locating wetlands?
Yeah, there are different approaches to that. You don't necessarily have to map them to regulate them. You can define them and then have them actually mapped on a case-by-case basis. One example that was that has worked out well is in the town of New Paltz. They did not have a regulatory map for their wetlands because it can be, it can be impossible to map things like vernal pools that are, in wooded areas, and you may not know unless you went out and, searched every square foot of the town. But what they did was they provided a free inspection one time for any landowner who wanted to know if they had wetlands on their site before putting in some proposal. They could get a free inspection from the town wetlands inspector. So that was a way that New Paltz handled it. There are different examples of how different municipalities handle that.
Thanks. A related question is about whether every project, big or small, needs to require field flagging of wetland boundaries.
That's a really tough issue because, right, so if there are wetlands on a site, but it's a small project and it's not an applicant who would otherwise go get a wetlands consultant to map their wetland, what do you do? So just to contrast that with a larger project, normally the applicant would have their own wetlands inspector go out and flag the wetland, and then they would submit it to, if they thought that there was a state regulated wetland, they would submit it to DEC to validate the mapping and make sure that the buffer is being protected. If they thought it might be a federally jurisdictional wetland, they would send it to the Army Corps for a jurisdictional determination. Those are the mechanisms to make sure that you're not infringing on a regulated wetland. The only kind of workaround I can suggest is if you can just stay away from those areas. So if the applicant thinks that this may be regulated and doesn't want to go to the expense of going through those jurisdictional steps, they can just locate their project outside of those potentially regulated areas. If that's not possible, then pretty much they do need to go through that process of mapping and verifying with the agencies. And we will have to wait and see how DEC plans to handle that with state wetlands. Now that they're changing from the map-based to the non-map-based system, there may be some additional guidance in the regulations that come out.
Thanks. Another related question is about a town that has natural resource maps created by Hudsonia, including habitat mapping, and wetlands are part of those habitats that are mapped. The planning board, however, is wondering whether they can consider those maps created by Hudsonia as, quote, official. And I think maybe base decisions on them.
Ingrid, I don't want to just keep taking the questions. Do you mind, or do you want me to? I mean, what I would say to that is, if they want the map to be regulatory, to require something, then it would need to be adopted by the town board as some kind of regulation under the zoning. But if the map just exists and a project comes in and the planning board has that mapping, when they do their seeker review, I think they would have a responsibility to look at that mapping as part of their seeker analysis of whether there are impacts on the site. So if a site has a lot of wetlands shown on the Hudsonia produced map, I think the planning board should then require that to be looked at. You know, have the applicant do a field study of those wetlands, for example.
Thanks. Another question is about wetland and watercourse inspectors, whether those are full-time positions and how municipalities fund those positions. If you happen to know.
I could chime in on this one just from anecdotal knowledge of some different municipalities that have similar positions. I think it depends. There's a range of approaches. So some municipalities will hire this on a contractual basis, hire a wetlands consultant to serve in this position. And that work is often primarily funded through the fees paid by applicants. And however, then the town might have to set aside a small budget for the wetland inspector to handle other matters that might be outside of the scope of project review, or for instance, in dealing with evaluating potential violations to the law. So I know that's how the town of New Paltz handles the budgeting for the wetlands inspector. But I think some other communities do have full-time positions, and that these inspectors may carry out additional code enforcement roles in those communities.
So the only other question I see is was asked kind of before you got really deep into the local protections part. So I'm not sure if that's kind of still a valid question, or maybe you just want to add on if you have examples of particular local streams laws.
I think that in that Department of State publication, there are a number of examples, both for streams and wetlands. I think that's a great resource for folks to browse.
Yeah, and I'll just point out one nuance we've discovered, at our conservation and land use team is that actually has a researcher, graduate student at, sorry, not a graduate student, she's a postdoc at Cornell working on a study and has been compiling wetland and watercourse laws. And one of the things we've noticed is some communities, they'll have a wetland law, but they'll define watercourses within their definition of wetlands. So the wetland law will actually apply to both wetlands and streams. That's something to pay attention to as you're looking at some of these models, because ideally I think it makes a lot of sense to be addressing both resources in one law.
And another question just came in about towns, maybe adjoining towns hiring consultants to support both their towns, say with wetland mapping or other responsibilities.
Yeah, that's a terrific idea, and towns regularly share services like that.
So we're just about at 2:30, and I just want to thank Emily and Ingrid again for your presentations. For folks, as you exit, you will see a little pop-up 4-question survey. So please do fill that out and give us your feedback. And then also you will receive a follow-up email with the recording and some links. That will take a few days though. takes a few days to get the recording up on the website. And your certificates will also be emailed to you at the conclusion of the webinar. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Emily. Thanks again for
Yeah, thank
the
you.
presentation.
All right, take care.
All right, have a great afternoon. Bye, Christine.